Hey everyone, I'm Adam, a junior undergraduate fellow here at the Notre Dame International Security Center, and I'm interviewing Dr. Colbourn. So firstly, I was just hoping if you could summarize your talk, summarize the themes of your upcoming book, and kind of just give us an idea of what's going to be both in the talk today as well as the upcoming book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk today about a book project that I'm very much in the weeds of writing right now. But the project itself is an international history of NATO as an alliance from its founding in the late 1940s through to the present. And so the major theme running through the book is a really simple but big one, which is that the alliance is incredibly complicated. It has different functions and forms, it's changed over the years, and it is this kind of unruly mass of big states and small states, and then shaped by a bunch of things that are also outside the alliance, right? So if we think about the history of NATO, it's not just the history of the members and the signatories to the original treaty, it's also about how everyday citizens think about the alliance, about how the alliance has shaped international politics, about how it's interacted with and engaged with adversaries. And so the idea behind the book is to tell a sort of big picture survey of all of those different pieces of NATO as an alliance over the last 75 years and counting. So it's a small project.
Absolutely. And kind of on the complication point, you brought this up in the read ahead. I wanted to talk to you in person about it. So you mentioned how NATO is an alliance of unequal equals, which seems obviously kind of contradictory inherently. So that's very interesting. So I just kind of wanted to ask, in your experience writing this book and just NATO's history, do you think there's ever been a barrier to NATO? Do you think that kind of impedes NATO's effectiveness? Or do you think that NATO's been able to overcome that sort of equal power distribution?
Yeah, I think it's always been a source of tension and friction because you have two different founding principles or core mechanisms in the alliance that don't always sit neatly with one another, right? On the one hand, it is an arrangement based on the power of the United States, right? It is the United States that is the superpower in the Cold War world. It is the United States that has a nuclear arsenal and extends that deterrent power across much of the transatlantic world. And the United States is more powerful than every other member of the alliance. That is true in 1949 when they signed the treaty. It's true in 2024. And so there is some tension that results from the fact that the United States is so much more powerful than the other member states. And then even more tension comes from the fact that the alliance is one that functions, at least in theory, on consultation and on consensus. Right, so if we open a newspaper, or more accurately a web browser, and read the news today and think about it, we often focus on the states in the alliance who play the role of a spoiler. So Turkey or Hungary might come to mind for us today. And they can wield real power in the alliance because it is a consensus-based organization. And so there's been lots of friction over the years about whether the United States has too much influence, whether smaller states have too much influence because of the consensus norms, whether or not enough consultation is happening, whether or not too much consultation is happening. And so there is this sort of constant flux and negotiation and renegotiation between the allies that is central to NATO's history and its evolution over the years.
Interesting. Kind of back on that historical perspective. So you mentioned in the read ahead that way back in 1949, when the United States, ascended to NATO and the alliance became what it was, again, a very U.S.-centric alliance, that marked a very clear turning point in U.S. foreign policy. That prior to that point, the U.S. either been very isolationist or had been making attempts to become isolationist. And that after World War II, there was sort of a discussion about, is the U.S. going to now revert back to an isolationist policy, or is it going to fully embrace this new world order, of which it was an arbiter of bringing about? But NATO obviously made that just an impossible reality. But as we look today, there are many calls in the U.S. political sphere for kind of a return to not necessarily isolationism, but kind of an isolationist-ish policy through America First, neo-isolationism. So my question to you is, do you foresee a potential future in where that turning point in 1949 could be reversed in the upcoming decades, or do you think it's just, so set in stone through NATO that it's just not feasible?
Yeah, I think one of the things that history is a good teacher of is that things look permanent until they're not anymore. Right? We might think that change is impossible until one day change is possible, right? People talked about German unification as though it was a pipe dream for much of the Cold War. And then between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the formal unification of the two Germanys, that was only 11 months, right? There was no change, and then all at once, tons of change. And so as a historian, Sure, of course it's possible. And I think one of the things and themes that runs through not just the history of NATO, but of US foreign policy more generally, is that there have been deep debates over whether, how, when, and where the United States should be engaged in the world and what that should look like. So even in the periods that we sometimes refer to as isolationist, if you asked most people in Central America, South America, the Western Hemisphere broadly, they probably would not have described the United States as isolationist in those periods, right? That tradition in the United States really was one about staying separate from the old world.
Right.
And that's where NATO was revolutionary in many respects, was signing this standing, entangling alliance with the old world. But there's no guarantee that just because that is the way the past has been since 1949, that we couldn't return to an older tradition of US foreign policy that predated 1949. So I think it's very much an open question.
Right, and on the topic of open questions, kind of, I understand you're a historian, but a question looking forward to the future here. My final question, so obviously Russian invasion of Ukraine has presented an extreme challenge to NATO, maybe the foremost challenge NATO's faced in the past 2 decades. There was obviously conversations about bringing Ukraine into NATO prior to this and kind of expanding the NATO security umbrella to the Ukrainian border. Obviously, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's not feasible right now. So how do you see NATO's response in the coming, say, 5 to 10 years with the Russian invasion in Ukraine? And how do you think NATO can be a player in either bringing about a peace or securing a more permanent sort of stability within Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think this is the big picture question right now that the alliance is confronting. So clearly the full-scale renewed invasion in February of 2022 really changed the security conversation for NATO. I think there had been some transformation after 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea, and then the seizure of the Donbass and fighting in Donetsk and Luhansk. But the real big change in NATO's posture has been galvanized by the post-February 2022 landscape. And the Russians are once again in NATO circles seen as a key, if not the most important threat to security in the Euro-Atlantic area. But consensus or rough consensus around that does not easily translate over into policy choices about what to do next.
Right.
And so you pointed to one really big thorny question, which is whether or not Ukraine will be able to join NATO and what the time horizon for that looks like. That is very much an open question, and I think as open a question as it has been since 2008, right? At the Bucharest summit, when the Ukrainians and the Georgians were given the sort of broad promise that one day they might be able to join the alliance, but no concrete steps towards that. Much as the geopolitical circumstances have changed since then, that broad trend is still true, and I don't see a lot of potential avenues for that to change in the immediate future. I think the bigger question for NATO is whether in this geopolitical climate, the alliance can retool and equip itself to really meet the challenges at hand, right? Are they able to construct an organization at 32 that is able to meet the challenges posed by the Russians to the Euro-Atlantic region? Or is the structure simply ill-equipped to meet the realities of today? And so it seems to me that actually a lot of the big questions right now in the next 5 to 10 years are ones about first principles. Can the alliance survive? Do enough of the allies actually believe in the value and purpose of the alliance anymore? Can the alliance actually deter the Russians from taking further aggressive action? Where does Ukraine fit in that picture? And so here, right, if we come back to the question of membership, so the last unknown I would point to is, what do you do for the Ukrainians in the intervening? Even if they're still moving towards membership, right, that stated goal in 2008, who can extend a security guarantee credible enough to the Ukrainians to bridge that gap? If it's not NATO, who are the essential pieces of NATO? Is it some member states? Is it parallel architecture? Does that challenge the future of NATO in the security order? And those are very big questions, but I think that the real ones that the alliance is struggling to figure out how to navigate today.
Well, that's very interesting. And Dr. Colbourn, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed sitting down with you.